I do want to start today, though, this evening rather, with the idea that what the election outcomes from just a few weeks ago are part of a longer-term transformation, what I call the Great Transformation, of American and this global society as we become fully ensconced in the digital age. And I think that when you come to understand and look at it that way, and extricate yourself, pull yourself out of this red-blue construct which kind of obsessively consumes most of our days, I'm hoping that you will find a little bit more peace and calm and understanding despite the chaos that is around and before us. The name The Great Transformation is actually a topic I write on almost daily. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about that because it's really the redefinition of our understanding of institutions. And by institutions, what I mean is those things that we as a species agree upon as a structure to allow us to live in a civilized place, a civilized world, a civilized community, and go about our days with the balance of how big we want that power to be in government, the influence that impacts our lives as individuals, and the pursuit of happiness, as I guess Jefferson once wrote and Lockean principles first argued for. What does that mean in this digital age? And I find myself thinking very oftentimes about the change of what our species, of what human beings went through when we went from being a largely the agricultural era into the industrial age. And the stressors of what that was for society and for people were extraordinary. They were things that we had never dealt with before. Suddenly, human beings had to create society that were dealing with diseases that never existed before as people lived in more dense areas. We had to figure out how to police people in a way that we had never dealt with before, when in 1880, 85, 90% of people lived out and worked out on the farm, and by 1920, over half of us now lived in cities. This all happened during a 30, 40-year transformation as we moved from the agricultural era into the industrial age and dramatically reimagined and rethought our society. There was nobody alive, there was no politician alive in 1880 that had the solutions for the problems that were needed in 1920. But we figured it out. And we're in the process of figuring that out now as we are fully, deeply ensconced in the digital age. For people of a certain age, like myself, I think I'm probably alone here in being a little over 50, so that's a joke, that's a punchline. Thank you for that. People who remember the hierarchical nature of our social structures. Almost everything that we have built as a people have a hierarchical nature, whether it's the church, whether it's government, whether it's the media, whether it's academia, whether it's the military. All of these things that we've built as a species are based off of the idea, this premise, that there was at one point somebody with a club who could beat up everybody else or kill everybody else, and we started to band around that structure and built everything accordingly. Information structures began to flow in those same ways, and the currency of power was delegated from the top down. That has defined who we are forever, forever. It's the entirety of our human experience. But in the digital age, that doesn't work. And it's why we're experiencing some of the fastest collapse in confidence and trust in our institutions right now. We have a political party on the American right today, which is essentially not an ideological party anymore. It's essentially a populist movement whose primary glue is tearing down institutions that do not work. It's vilifying those institutions, or at best, partisanizing those institutions. And in response, the American left, it has sought to fill that void by becoming a more establishment party. It's institutionalist by its very nature. Let's preserve and protect the Constitution. Let's protect democracy. The language of what the political party, the Democrats, are saying is essentially, let's be the establishment. And from a policy perspective, not just from their language, not just from their tone, but from a policy perspective, to watch the Democratic Party fill the vacuum that has been vacated by the Republican Party has been extraordinary. Anybody watch the Democratic National Convention? Phenomenal. You were there. People were there. I'm watching the Democratic Party, a party led by a black woman from San Francisco, take on and embody the most conservative border security policy on immigration, perhaps in the history of the Democratic Party, at least going back to the early mid-1990s. This is a party that has overseen more fracking and energy production than any administration, Republican or Democrat, in the history of our country. It's a party who has built up the muscular nature of our foreign policy in a way that Ronald Reagan would blush. NATO added 3 new members as a bulwark against the Russian threats. The centerpiece of the economic opportunity plan that Kamala Harris articulated was this. You're not going to believe this, but this is true. It was tax cuts for corporations to allow ownership for workers in those same corporations. I say that only because that was Jack Kemp's policy as the HUD secretary under Ronald Reagan. And this is not a criticism. This is an observation about how much the expansiveness of the political ideological policy field has been created as Republicans have vacated their ideological core. And the Republicans, for their own part, the nominee for the Republican presidential ticket, excuse my laughter, ran on the largest tax increase in the history of the country. Let me say that again, because tariffs are taxes if you don't know. The Republican nominee ran and won on the largest tax increase in the history of the country. Sorry, Walter Mondale. Sorry what we did to you, right? Like, this is extraordinary. The Republican Party has become the isolationist, protectionist party. Union membership. The Teamsters were asking for a speaking space at the floor of the Republican National Committee right next to Hulk Hogan, right? Like, something is changing. None of these parties make sense until you understand that our institutions don't make sense. And until we find a way to address what that means in the digital age as informations flow more horizontally as opposed to vertically, and the more trust and confidence erodes in those same institutions like government, which has been taking a beating for a very, very long time, academia, which, whew, boy, tough year in academia. Sorry, academics, tough year, right? All of these institutions have lost confidence at such a rate that they are held in the lowest esteem in the American public in the history of modern polling. In fact, for those over the age of 60, confidence in institutions is at the lowest rate ever since the 1930s, when Gallup began using modern polling techniques to scientifically gauge public opinion, as has the confidence and idea of America itself. America itself is being questioned. It's why it's so easy to get half of the country to believe that elections are stolen, or if our side doesn't win, we can simply say it was stolen because people don't have belief in the outcomes of it anyway. That America is essentially stolen, so what are elections anyway but these obstacles that are simply getting in the way? And at the same time, we're going through this unprecedented demographic transformation. For the first time in our history, the United States of America will be a non-white majority country. In 15 short years, America will be a non-white majority country. Plurality will have ancestry from places other than European countries. And we all know about the spasms that that has created in our society. We saw them here first in many ways during the mid-1990s here in California. But a funny thing happened in that 30-year, by the way, this is the 30th year anniversary for Proposition 187, for those who might remember Proposition 187 30 years ago. Show of hands, a couple of people out there? Okay, good. So we all know what I'm talking about. In 1994, largely in response to large numbers of immigration flows, both legal and illegal, 63% of white Americans, white Californians rather, voted for Proposition 187. 63% is a big number. Only 23% of Latinos supported it. It was the first time Latinos voted as a multi-generational voting bloc. It was when the modern era, the modern political framework for the Latino political structures we've known it was created. It was catalyzed in this moment. People, good friends of mine, many of you know them as well, people, young people, at the time young, people like Alex Padilla, my good friend, U.S. Senator from California, Antonio Villaraigosa, longtime my political nemesis. You'll read about it in the book, who I ultimately run his campaign for governor in 2018, on a policy platform, incidentally, focused on Latinos and the working class as a harbinger of things to come, a warning of what the Democratic Party was facing if it didn't start addressing working class issues for non-white people. Tony Cardenas, Lou Correa, and on and on and on. This entire political class was established in 1994. But a funny thing also happens just a month before this last election. The Los Angeles Times conducts a survey and asks a question of Latino voters, and the question is, do you believe that the undocumented are a benefit or a burden on California society? And 63% of Latinos say the undocumented are a burden. 63% of Latinos in 2024 say the undocumented are a burden. In 1994, 30 years ago, 63%, the exact same number of whites, said the same thing about Latinos in the vote on Proposition 187. 30 years ago to the month, those numbers are exactly the same. And yet, where 30 years ago it catalyzed an entire generation of a racially and ethnically focused voting bloc, multi-generational, with immigration and the undocumented, protection for the undocumented, advocacy for the undocumented, defining that glue that held these generations together. Within one generation, that same Latino voting bloc is virtually identical to the number of that white electorate that it was speaking against, that it was catalyzed against. So what happened? Well, there's going to be books that we'll have available outside. You can read and find out exactly what happened. But in a nutshell, let me say this is what happened. In many ways, this is a typical assimilative story that we've gone through in this country with the Italians, the Poles, the Irish, the Greeks, Jews. It's that assimilative story. But in many ways, it's very different. In California, with Latinos generally, it's been different for a few reasons that I want to explore with you for just a moment. And then I want to talk about the uniqueness of California in this story. Because, and this is important, California was a lagging indicator in this rightward shift that happened and began in every one of the other 49 states. California, one of the most diverse states in the Union, the largest Latino state by population, is behind the rest of the country as it relates to the bipartisan shift or the rightward shift of Latinos to the Republican Party. I want to explore that with you for just a moment. But first, I want to talk about why the assimilative nature of what is happening in our country right now is unique for this moment in time. The first is when the Irish and the Italian and other groups came over at Ellis Island 100 years ago, they came generally in 15 to 20-year spurts. And the diasporas came often in very large numbers. The numbers of Irish that were coming into New York was far greater than the number of Latinos coming into California from 1985, 86, from the Immigration Reform and Control Act up until 2017, 2007, excuse me, that 40-year wave didn't bring the same percentage of the number of Irish that were coming during a 20-year exodus from Ireland to the shores of this country in New York. But it stopped. It slowed over 20 years. And we've all heard those romantic stories of people who came over as 8-year-old or 10-year-old or 15-year-old stowaways on a boat, sneaking up, coming across Ellis Island, bumming a few bucks to allow themselves to become processed on Ellis Island, having their names changed. They were never going back to the mother country. Both of those are not the case here. As I mentioned, we're sitting really at the tail end of one of the largest Latin American migratory waves this country's ever experienced. So the sheer size of what happened made it different. The length of time also made it different. The proximity to mother country made it different. We're not returning back across the Atlantic Ocean and going back to the mother country. A lot of us go back for posadas, go back for Christmas every year. Some people live there every day crossing the border, especially here in San Diego. I'm telling you stuff that you know better than any other city, perhaps a few exceptions in Texas know. And the fourth difference is that technology allows us to consume content and stay in closer contact than that 15-year-old stowaway Italian kid in 1920s New York who would never talk to their parents again. Today they're Facebook friends and we're chatting with them on WhatsApp on a daily basis, and we're consuming content made in that mother country. All of these have extended and dramatically changed the immigration and assimilation story, so much so that I would argue that the melting pot construct no longer works. In fact, I would argue Latinos aren't melting into the pot of America as much as the mainstream pot is melting into a changing Latino identity. How else do you explain things like Bad Bunny, right? The top selling music artist in the country who doesn't sing a word in English of any of his songs, right? These are not being purchased exclusively by Latino buyers. This is being consumed by mainstream English buyers. Soccer, the explosion of soccer comes along with it, which will soon be our national pastime. Sorry, NFL, it's coming. That day is coming. So, an applause even. All right, this transformation means that America is becoming Latino as much as Latinos are becoming American. And I know that there's a lot of discussion about why Latinos were shifting to the right? And that rightward shift, a lot of people, especially from certain demographics that I won't point out, but would suggest this is about machismo and machismo culture. This is all about that strong, paternally focused culture that you have. I'm going to dispel that notion, spend a whole chapter on it in the book. Or you're all Catholic, you're all socially conservative Catholics. I dispel that in another chapter of the book. Or the caudillo, you all want a strong man, the Latin American strong man. Most of them put in place by American, Central Intelligence Agency funding, but we'll set that aside for just a moment. This idea of machismo, I spent a lot of time dispelling, because I think it is probably one of the laziest ethnic tropes I think I've ever heard. There are more Latinas elected in Sacramento than Latinos. We elect women at rates far faster than any other race or ethnic group in the country. And it's not just a blue state phenomenon, by the way. Texas is almost at parity. Florida is almost at parity. New Jersey, of course, blue state, becoming red very quickly. Passaic County, by the way, had one of the largest rightward shifts. The Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, not even Mexicans. We'll get into the regional variations in just a moment, but Passaic had one of the largest shifts to the right. It's like 70% of the Latinos, the Hispanics, that serve in the state legislature in New Jersey are women. Hispanic women have accomplished in one generation what white women have not been able to accomplish since suffrage, which is basic equanimity, equality in representation. This is extraordinary. We have the largest gender gap, by the way, of any race or ethnicity, because we also have the largest diploma divide. We all familiar with the diploma divide? The idea that those with a college degree are rapidly moving to the Democratic Party and those without are rapidly moving towards the Republican Party. It is probably the single most definitive characteristic that is reshaping our country's politics. The idea that it is a cultural issue related to whether or not you went to college, not an economic issue. a cultural issue as to whether or not you went to college that is reshaping the contours of our political system. Hispanic women are attending and graduating from college at rates far faster than our men, faster than any other race or ethnic group. And as a result, it's manifesting itself at the ballot box, where our women are voting more and more Democratic and our men are voting more and more Republican. In large part because women, Hispanic women, Latinas, are going to have much more of the opportunities to lead the institutions by the nature of their college degrees. They will be more and more academics. They will be more and more the leaders of nonprofits. They will be more and more C-suite executives. They will be more and more in management. Our men will be more and more laborers. 1 in 5 Hispanic men in this country is employed in the construction industry or a related field. 1 in 5 Hispanic men are swinging hammers and building the homes that we desperately need to house people in a time of shortage, even though they are the least likely ethnic and economic demographic to be able to afford those same houses that they're building. It is a problem, and it's a problem that's going to get worse fast, because that divide is not just a partisan divide, it ultimately becomes a social divide. And I think anybody who has an even casual understanding of the Latino culture is not shocked by the fact that we choose women to lead us. We are absolutely a maternally focused culture, and I will have this debate with anybody all day long. What other countries, what other people would choose the Virgen of Guadalupe or whatever Virgen or whatever Marian image to lead? Because every Latin American country has their own version of the Marian image as their source of not just religiosity, but their national source of pride, right? There's a reason why we have Mary when here in the States we have Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam looks like he just came out of a Trump rally, by the way, doesn't he? He's got like the full flag regalia and a top hat and a long goatee. Nothing wrong with that, it's just an observation. And for those of you saying, well, what about the Statue of Liberty? Statue of Liberty was a gift from the French, 100 years after we were born, because the French being French are going to do that. And I say that because those different perspectives really, I think, lead us to a different cultural understanding of this clash of where we're heading. And I don't think it's going to be a spectacular fireborn clash. I just think it's going to be a unique melding. And I argue in my book that the Latinization of America is going to lead to the feminization of America, not in terms of effeminate qualities, but in terms of a much more female perspective from our institutions, if our institutions can hold that long. Which gets me back to that opening. The opening part of this, which was our institutions and the public confidence and support of those institutions are collapsing. We are consciously choosing leaders who will nominate Matt Gaetz to be Attorney General, that will choose Tulsi Gabbard to oversee our intelligence community, that will pick Kash Patel to be the director of our Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is not a simple movement towards conservatism in the way that we have seen in the past with Reagan-era type of transformation in the way we perceive this role of government on the right-left spectrum. This is something wholly different. And I'm not here to instill fear about that. I'm actually, despite all of this, extraordinarily optimistic about where all of this is heading. Because regardless of who won this election, there was never going back, to put it in Kamala Harris's words. We're not going back. We're not going back. Either way, we can't go roll this back to a pre-2016 era where everything was working. It's not working. It hasn't been working. It's working less and less all of the time. And we need to radically, dramatically reimagine and transform our institutions in a way that, candidly, people of my age and older aren't capable of doing any more than a 50-year-old farmer coming out of upstate New York, coming down into lower Manhattan in 1920, could imagine building a 90-story skyscraper. That's not going to happen. And that's not necessarily something to fear, because there are values, there are cultural characteristics that need to be imparted generationally into this new age. That's, frankly, these values are needed now more than ever at a time when our human relations are changing, our communications and our sense of community are being completely upended. And ironically, and I'm going to close with this because I really want to hear what Zach has to say about all of this. Ironically, I think at precisely the moment when we cannot trust the institution and the awesome power of the federal government, that is precisely what we need to be the spark to reimagine our institutions. Because without that, we will continue to believe, and here's where I'm going to lose most of the audience, in things like, if we just agreed to the Paris Accords, we could solve climate change. Climate change is very real. I've never doubted climate change, but I've always doubted the ability of governments to solve such a monumental problem globally. That's not the way climate change will be solved. We are on the verge of dramatic population decline. Pronatal policies cannot solve that problem. Government can't solve that problem for us. We're weeks, months, maybe years away from a dramatic transformation with artificial intelligence. Even though he's a policy expert, and another reason I wanted him here, Zach has led the country on some of the artificial intelligence regulations that we're dealing with. I don't believe government can regulate artificial intelligence. At best, it can set parameters on 3 of these very large existential threats facing us. But the institutions we have now don't work. And what I would suggest is that doesn't mean that there's an apocalyptic scenario coming, any more than the movement away from our farm in upstate New York and moving to Lower Manhattan to find work meant. Yes, it's stressful. Yes, it's change. Yes, there are a whole host of questions we're going to have to ask and answer that we haven't even imagined yet. But I think in many ways, this marks the beginning of a new era, guided largely by a rapidly emerging Latino community that is going to set the values and cultural perspective of this country in a very unique way. And it's why I titled my book, The Latino Century. So thank you very much with that. And Zach, let's have this come.
How is that hopeful? Did I miss a part that was? I mean, this whole...
The reason why I'm hopeful, there's a lot of reasons why I'm hopeful. But the main one, I believe, is fundamentally and foundationally this. And many of you, I think, know or have heard of the Lincoln Project. Some of you will hate me immediately for that. Some of you will like me for some of that. But one of my favorite people that I got to work with is a gentleman by the name of George Conway. I think a lot of you probably know who George Conway is. George is a brilliant constitutional lawyer. He's actually one of the few of us that was not a political consultant. And we've talked a lot about these topics, talked about them a lot during that time. And he said something really important. I referenced it earlier, which is you cannot write a constitution to protect itself from a people that don't want it. There are no safeguards. There's no reforms that you can institute constitutionally to protect the norms and the mores which are being violated every Tuesday and Wednesday now in Washington, D.C. If the people don't want the Constitution, there's nothing you can put down on paper that's going to protect us from it. What's different, though, at this moment is what is emerging is the people that do believe in it, that are hopeful about America, that do have a confidence in the institutions. That's what you need to continue the American experiment, is just the belief that this system of government, that this economic system is actually the best or better than from whence you came. That is the fresh blood that America needs to continue generationally the American experiment. And we're getting a massive influx of that at precisely the moment when we need it. And there's no reforms, there's no economic changes, there's no public policy, there's no charismatic figure that's going to come out and save us on a white horse, and everything's going to be okay, and we're going to go back to the Obama years, and everybody's okay. The only thing that can save us are the seeds being planted internally inside of us demographically. And not only have they been planted, we're starting to see those sprouts start to emanate. And I'm just very hopeful about that possibility.
You could have shared that earlier, is my point. I mean, Mike, you know that I was a national media surrogate for Biden as well as then for Harris. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I was a press secretary for Obama, did a lot of national media stuff for the last multiple presidential campaigns. What has been interesting, and I think would be useful tonight partially to talk about, the thing that I found fascinating is this transition of what I considered to be, I wrote a best-selling book on communications.
Yeah.
I actually feel like I don't know the path of communication in the current siloed system. I mean, we can go, you and I have been on together, MSNBC panels, we've been on CNN panel. Yeah. Nobody's watching those things.
Right.
I mean, we're just speaking to the same, they're not. I mean, you look at the numbers. You look at, I was, for Biden in 2020, I was one of 4 Dems that was the Fox surrogate every week, always.
That was fun to watch.
Until my wife was a little sick of the death threats coming into our house, so picky, there's like, but what is interesting is you're talking about, even on a really watched show, maybe 6 million people across the country, which is functionally nobody. I mean, you're talking hundreds of thousands sometimes on a CNN show. How then, you started talking about the digital side. How do we communicate? So let's say you want to run for president. Let's say you want to establish, it used to be a time you'd have 3 people reading you the news. We had a common sense of fact as a result of that. I don't think that we have a common sense of what defines fact anymore. Right. So how would you advise a current political person or even a business to operate right now in that system?
Well, look, I think the first thing to understand is in many ways we have been here before. Disinformation, misinformation is not new. Benjamin Franklin made his first fortune peddling in misinformation, by the way. William Randolph Hearst built a castle on disinformation, got us into the Spanish-American War on a lie that the Spanish blew up an American ship in its harbor. Never happened, never true, but that allowed Teddy Roosevelt to get the Rough Riders together and go take San Juan Hill. It was all predicated on a lie. So I'm not excusing what's going on, but it is important to look back from a historical perspective and understand we have been here before. Okay, in a lot of ways we have been here before. The solution, of course, that's much more problematic because we have not been in a digital age before. And so I don't have the specific answer to that other than to say, we've dealt with similar problems before, and we are going to have to find different ways of working together institutionally as a people. And I don't even necessarily mean as an American people. I do mean institutionally as a species in a way that we never have before. And I'm not afraid of it. I'm actually intrigued by it because if it's, and I hate to sound like a biologist here, but we are an incredibly innovative, adaptive species. Like, we're really good at survival. We're really good at it. And I don't mean to be Pollyannish and suggest that this isn't going to be a very difficult, uncomfortable, awkward struggle. But another reason why I'm optimistic is through that struggle is where you build national character. And I think one of the great afflictions we have as Americans at this moment in time is that up until recently, we haven't been tested as a country, essentially, since the end of the Cold War, 1989, until I would argue, September 11th was, it wasn't quite as a direct a threat as we believed it to be. And I don't mean to discount what that did to all of us. I think it forever changed our nation, but we've been a global superpower, the sole global superpower for so long that we've got a couple of generations of Americans that don't have a sense of what struggle is. And you can't pass a virtue and a belief and confidence and passion for freedom and liberty and a self-governing republic unless you fought for it or struggled with it a little bit. You can't appreciate what it is. You just think it's just natural. Like we were born into the land of milk and honey, and the unicorns and rainbows have always been here. And we know that that is just such a small aberration in the course of human history that we're really coming out of this aberrant time into what human beings have always dealt with, which is struggling to fight for this. And America's going to really define whether or not this is what we want. And if those values hold true, and I believe they will, I think we will find the institutional structures to meet the new age.
So I think you probably hear this a lot. I mean, people will tell you, I disagree with the Democratic Party, disagree with the Republican Party. I just want common sense, and you're a common sense person, and I can agree with you. And then they vote in a relatively predictable way at the end of the day. Everybody views themselves as an independent. I'll just put it that way. And no one actually votes that way. Right. And in fact, even when you are, just so you can give a little behind the scenes of the political stuff, if you're a no, I don't need you to raise your hand, but statistically speaking, 3 to 4 in 10 of you are no party preferences in this room, okay? We will literally buy data from the grocery store to know your purchasing preferences to determine who you really are. Because when you're buying Tom's of Maine, you ain't voting for Trump, okay? You can claim you're an independent, but you're not. No. But the thing that I want to say, though, to this is it true, in your sense, that there really is this universal principle? You mentioned September 11th. I would say that for at least a short time, there was a real coming together as America as an idea, where people came together irrespective of party, post 9/11. Is that possible in the country again, of the idea, of this sense of people saying, I don't want to be in this tribalistic thing. I can't stand what each individual party is doing, yet they still vote a certain way. Is there still a lane for somebody or something to actually come in and unify?
The answer to that, it jumped into my head immediately, and it's a very different answer than I thought it would be. So here it is. There is no room in this country for that, but there is room in the world for that. See, one of the things, I was asked by the Zelensky administration to help out on communication strategy within a few months of the Russian incursion into the Donbass. This is in 2021, right? This is within months of the invasion. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to do some counter communication strategy into Russia to see if they could undermine the regime, Putin's regime, that way. And so I went to Kyiv, and one of the things that I learned was that there are certain constituencies throughout the world, not just in the Western world, because I went to Brazil to work against Jair Bolsonaro to unseat that dictator. How I got into the anti-dictator business, I don't know. That's a different topic, different book. But what I found was commonalities of culture and values and techniques that people that were pro-democracy, pro-freedom, and anti-authoritarianism, that was cross-cultural, cross-language, cross-continents. And I believe very firmly that we're entering an age where parties and political movements across borders is going to be a defining feature of this next decade. So that if you are supportive of unseating an authoritarian like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, you will be working and resourcing and helping in an interconnected way, across communities virtually, to help those efforts be successful. The authoritarians are already doing this, by the way, right? They've been sharing communications strategies. They've been trying to upend elections. Incidentally, the United States has been upending other people's elections for a very long time, okay? We talk about the Russians doing it. Yes, they're doing it. Are the Chinese doing it? Yes, the Chinese are doing it. Yes, the Iranians are doing it. We were the ones who started it. Okay, we've been doing this for a very long time in other countries. So that we're not getting a lot of, there aren't a lot of people in the global south specifically who are saying, well, sorry, this is terrible what they're doing to you, America, this is awful. But my point is, if you look, for example, and we first saw this, I think in Brexit were the early signs of this. If you look at the vote in rural non-college educated United Kingdom, Britain, those voting patterns looked eerily similar to rural counties throughout the United States. And if you look at urban voting patterns, they were eerily similar to what was happening in the urban core of the United States. And so you literally have more in common if you're a college-educated white worker in San Francisco with somebody who is a college-educated white worker in London than you have with somebody who is a non-college educated white worker in Arkansas as compared to somebody like in Cornwall. And the light kind of starts going on and saying, now I'm seeing this in Kyiv, I'm seeing this in Warsaw, I'm seeing this in London and Cornwall and in Sao Paulo and Rio and in Nebraska and Arkansas and Maricopa County. And you start to realize our sovereign states, the political state is starting, literally the institution of the state is starting to unwind as community and political movement starts to move across boundaries. And so I think that's going to be a defining feature. So you asked the question of what does that mean for the next presidential election? I don't know, but I think it's going to have, the answer to that is going to be the same as what is the outcome of the election going to be in France when Marine Le Pen just announces that there's going to be a vote of no confidence in France because the right is on the march in France. And that's going to be, rather than talking about it in terms of red and blue or in Democrat and Republican, we'll be talking about liberal values versus authoritarian values, and parties will begin to share information and resources and tactics and techniques and professionals across borders. That's going to be, I think, a defining feature of politics in the next age.
Do you think Trump's reelection was inevitable?
Was it inevitable? No. I think that I think it was entirely preventable. I wrote my book not as a prediction, although it became essentially that. I wrote my book as a warning. It could have been prevented. It absolutely could have been prevented. But, and this is really important, regardless of who won, this institutional transformation is well underway. And again, it's hard for people of my age and older to understand. We keep fighting as the Democratic Party is like protecting the institutions. Let's protect the institutions. You are no more able to protect the candle making industry in the era of the light bulb than you are to protect the institutions that we are barreling and moving down towards. And look, here in California, in many ways, we're the originalists of this thought. For the past 30 years, since I began my political career in Sacramento, hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on reform efforts. Al Gore was, reinventing government and how do we reform our systems? California Forward was spending, I think, $100 million from the biggest philanthropies in the state to make government more efficient and work. And I advised some of those groups. I worked with some of those groups. I argued and debated with some of those groups. And what I finally came to understand about a decade ago was you cannot reform the candle industry. And there's no point in trying. You have to reimagine what is needed going forward. So if Kamala Harris had become president, in many ways, and this, again, maybe the contrarian in me, in many ways that would have slowed our ability because we wouldn't have had the same urgency to redefine what needs to be done. And that's the opportunity. We have to view that as an opportunity. It should not paralyze us at all. This is the great opportunity to reimagine government and what it is itself, what the media is itself, because there's no going back, as Kamala said. We're not going back. And so we need to move forward. We can solve climate change. We can address population decline. We can make a more prosperous, beneficial, virtuous society in an era defined by artificial intelligence. We can do all of these things. I have no doubt about it. In fact, I'm confident all three of those may actually solve a lot of the problems that each one creates, which is the beauty of the moment. And that's the opportunity. It's why I'm so optimistic and excited about where we're at. A big part of what I want to do in my future is document it, write it, teach it, speak about it, go and visit it where it's happening. It's why I went to Ukraine. It's why I went to Brazil. It's why, I'm involved with all of these efforts. It's why I write on this daily, is because we're literally unfolding into a new era in a way that I think is very, very exciting. It's scary, but it's scary insofar only as you're not participating in it and offering what you can. You don't have to be right, but I want you to understand that as frightened as you may feel at this moment, there was once a farmer that decided, I've got to pack up from my farm in upstate New York and go to the city because that's where the jobs are. That's scary too. The first time you come over that hill in your horse and buggy and you see a 90-story skyscraper, it's gotta be kind of scary. People are flying through the air, 20 years after that in these big metal tubes. I mean, our human experience has gone through these things before, and this is going to be stressful, but I think there's every reason to believe it's going to be something better than bad.
You said that Kamala had said that we weren't going back. That was the tag. I would submit that in 16, 20, and 24, functionally, if there was a message, a coherent message out of the Trump campaign, it was, we're going to go back to a point in time that was never clear or clearly defined, sort of like an ideology that existed in our minds but not in our realities. And so what you then are saying, if we're not going back, but what appears to be the majority of the country, well, functionally the majority of the country, 49.8% will say, actually voted by choice to go back. But if the institutions are actually breaking, what is going back or going forward look like? People were choosing, they were asking for something different because the institutions are breaking, because they got screwed in the financial crisis. I mean, righteously so, post-2008. Democratic Party completely failed on that, by the way, recognizing that. But what does going forward look like when half the country is saying, I want to go back to an ideology? How do you reconstruct an institution with that dissonance then moving forward? How does an academic institution, how does the media, how does the government, how do we reconstruct that when half the country is saying we want to go back to something else?
Well, I'm not sure I believe that premise. And while it's a good tagline, I don't agree with that. I think a lot of Trumpism is nothing more than the same fear that a lot of people are feeling about the uncertainty of the age. And what he's selling is certainty. And like every snake oil salesman, you can't sell certainty in this world. There's no such thing. But it allows them to feel, if only for a moment, or when their man is in control, that there is somebody at the helm. One of the most fascinating, and look, I'm a Republican. I spent 30 years of my life in Republican politics. I was always opposed to Trump from the day he came down that golden escalator. I was one of the first, most vocal, strident critics, saying this is not just bad for the Republican Party, this is bad for the country, bad for the world. I've never hesitated on that. But I have a lot of colleagues and friends, 30 years of them, who to this day will say, well, Mike, I support him on the policy, knowing he's bad. And I'll say, well, what policy is that? Because Donald Trump doesn't know what policy he supports. There is no new ideology. That is a fraud. There's no philosophy of government. You've never heard Donald Trump extol the virtues of smaller government because he doesn't believe in that. He believes in whatever the moment provides, which is a defining feature of populism. The Republican Party at this moment is a countercultural movement, not terribly dissimilar from what the left was in the 60s. What do I mean by that? What I mean by it is it's resorting to attacking the leadership of institutions which have essentially been captured by the left. So they call it wokeism, whatever that is. We're against the woke, or as Ron DeSantis says, Florida's the place where the woke goes to die, like it's a little monster walking around or a mind virus. I mean, the whole language that they're talking about is peculiar and odd until you understand all it really means is we want to lead the rush to break down all these institutions that failed us. And in many ways, what we are witnessing is the failure of elitism. It's the failure of the professional class. It's the failure of the more educated and the leadership in this country and this world to provide the social contract that if I play by the rules as a working class folk, then my kids' lives will be better than mine. I know that's not true. My kid just graduated from Berkeley with a degree in data science a couple of months ago. A graduate's degree from UC Berkeley in data science. I cannot, with a straight face, tell him that California is possible for him. Think about that. So what does that mean for real people, right? Like that's not reality for 99% of his age cohort. And if that isn't true, then how can we come up with an ideology or a policy set that somehow works to tap into the sentiment of people who are just saying, none of this works, none of this works, none of this works. And the reason why I reject the basic premise of that is we have three elections now of Donald Trump. Each of us were telling us something very distinctly different if viewed in silos. But the beauty of three is 1 can be an aberration, 2 can be a coincidence, 3 is now a trend, right? In 2016, it was all kind of like, why? Let's go to the diners in West Virginia and learn about the white working class and why are you so upset and how have we failed you? In 2020, the election was so close that yeah, we breathed a sigh of relief and we got rid of them, but it was so close we were reminded that no, this is who we are. This is who America is. And this third time, it's just kind of almost a shrug, like, of course it's who we are. Look, perfect timing. That's a get off the stage. And so my point is the belief that somehow there's this desire to go back to a previous America. I buy that after 2016. I don't buy that 3 elections in a row saying the same thing at all. I think it's simply a countercultural movement in an election that, by the way, was not a landslide mandate election. This election was pretty damn close, okay? And it doesn't mean they're going to act that way and that the outcome isn't the same. But ultimately what I'm suggesting is there's probably a lot more explanation about the inaffordability at the moment for the right demographics and the loss of faith and confidence in institutions that has been continuing for a decade that is moving in this direction. That's what I think happened, and I think 3 elections in a row give us pretty good evidence that that's probably what it is.
Let's take some audience questions. Andrew, you're going to have a mic. I know we have a microphone. We're going to need microphones to ensure that you all end up on UCTV.
The Electoral College did its job. And as a woman who has served in elected office and invested in women's health care and know that we get much better returns by investing in healthy moms, these states are going to absolutely undermine what they seem to be trying to achieve. So I'm just curious, we haven't heard a lot of discussion of how, the Electoral College was really about protecting the interests of a certain group of people and is working very well. And there's a lot of us who feel like it's this election went just the way the country was designed it to go. Property owning, wealthy, white men held on to power. But I am curious what you think will happen as California works to improve access to reproductive health care. And the rest of these states are going in the absolute other direction. So more about kind of women's interests.
It's a great question, and it's one that really dominated and I think animated the country since the Dobbs decision. It brought the abstract to the existential for what was believed to be a wide swath of women, but what we learned was that wasn't true at all. In fact, the gender gap was smaller in this election than it has been in decades, meaning that issue was not motivating women. And Trump did better with non-college educated white women. 3 times he has increased his share with non-college educated white women. And Latinas actually moved to the right in a way that they had been breaking really aggressively to the left. So I really would really impress upon you to reconsider the premise of that question, which is women broadly do not believe that reproductive rights are the primary lens through which they are deciding how to vote. I mean, that's clear from this election. If anything is clear, it's that. And I think that that may change as the reality of those policies set in, but that's a broader statement about kind of like the blowback I've been getting from Latino attacks on social media, primarily from black and white progressives. On you've got it coming, you Latinos, you deserve what's coming, you're gonna get deported, you should go back to where you came from, horrible stuff. The blowback of what happens when the abstract becomes existential does change things. But there was, I was saying this, it's why one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I've seen immigration politics, and I was telling the White House, if you think abortion's going to save you in the face of an immigration fight, you are wrong. Because the only thing that scares white women more than losing bodily rights is the threat of a brown illegal man breaking into her house in the middle of the night. And that's exactly why they used that technique, why they used that tactic, and it worked exactly the way that I predicted that it would. I've seen it work for 30 years. And so a lot of people would push back, a lot of white, especially wealthier white progressive women for whom this is largely an animating issue, would say, you don't understand the power of women and Rovember's coming, and okay, you know, the polling data is pretty clear. We can move Republican women back on this issue. Non-college educated white women, when faced with that decision, are not going to vote for abortion rights as opposed to building a wall in the way that you think it would, and that's exactly what happened.
And just to touch on the first part of our question, I want to make sure we get to these additional questions. The Democrats would have the House if it wasn't for the North Carolina redistricting decision.
Yes.
There are little things through the courts, through the idiosyncrasies, and the Democrats, we've actually done a job to write ourselves out of the House of Representatives. Democratic states have independent commissions that draw districts and such. So we're playing by a different set of rules. We, meaning the Democrats, I should say, because ironically, the person to my left is actually on your ideological right there, stage right. But I think it's an important thing to recognize that none of that's going to change now. I mean, through the courts, it's clear that there's a Republican advantage baked into certain systems through the Electoral College and now even in some structures, the House, that makes it exceptionally difficult, other than in off-year elections, for us to really gain. And I think that the institution's argument on that is so complicated to get somebody motivated to show them that X decision leads to Y outcome 4, 8, 15 years later, that it's really too academic in a way to get the country to change, and it benefits too many states to constitutionally actually get it to change anyway. I agree with you about the underlying component of it, although at the end of the day, he got more votes anyway, so it wouldn't have mattered in a popular vote election. But I think that it isn't going to change is something we also need to recognize because of those.
Yeah, let me. I want to explore this a little bit more, and we'll be around a little bit here to answer everybody's questions. But I think I'm a very big believer in the Electoral College, by the way. In the same reason I'm a very big believer in the United States Senate. Is those are institutions, and we can say that they were set up for slaveholders and whatever. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But if you are truly a United States of America, there has to be an institutional way to tie you together. And that's why this elegant solution that the founders crafted was established, and I think it has worked well throughout our history. Every party that doesn't benefit, because in my early part of my career, it was the Republicans saying we need to get rid of the Electoral College. Why? Because the Democrats won. And then once the Democrats lose, they start going, wait a second, we need to get rid of this Electoral College thing. It's a crazy relic of the past. The problem, as I get back to George Conway, is you've got to win elections. You've got to build a majority and win an Electoral College system. That creates a stability that has lasted us at least 250 years, or almost 250. We'll see if we get there. But I think that that's part of the challenge.
But something happened. I was actually talking to a reporter at lunch today while Zach was eating his hamburger. He had a big cheeseburger for lunch. I was really impressed by
It was
that.
particularly large, yeah.
How do you do that? And I'm pacing up and down the sidewalk, and this reporter is asking me this question. The Democrats picked up these seats in California, in the House. Like, why was that so different in California than everywhere else? And I said, it wasn't. In fact, in 4 of the 5 most contested Senate seats, the Democrats picked up seats. They won, defended, or picked them up. Okay? The Democrats did not have that bad of a year, considering. And here's the real important point. If you look at 2024, it's almost the exact mirror image of 2020, where the incumbent party loses, but down ticket, the opposite party did extraordinarily, historically well. That's telling us something. The voters get it. They don't like either party, they don't trust either party, and they're voting methodically. I may not like Trump. The polling was telling us his favorabilities weren't as high as Kamala Harris. But I don't like where I'm at situationally either, so I'll vote for him again, but I'm gonna vote for Democrats for Senate and the House to make sure that the crazy doesn't get too out of control. That's the exact opposite of what they did in 2020 when they threw Donald Trump out and said, I'm voting for Joe Biden, but I'm voting for the Republicans because I don't trust those Democrats because they're crazy. And there's a lot of validity to both of those sentiments, and they're behaving more and more like that as voters get more and more methodical.
Questions?
Hi, Mike. First of all, as an 18-year-old, thank you for your faith in us to solve America.
Don't mess it up.
My question is, in this large reform that's going to happen, like in global and American culture, as it relates to elections and politics and institutions, what role do you think private institutions and companies, particularly like media companies, will play in that?
Well, they're going to play a huge role in it. We're already seeing it, right? But and again, I hate to go back to the example of climate change, but I think it's the very real existential threat where we're recognizing, well, and look, I've worked with different environmental groups in both an advisory capacity and as a critic, saying, look, I'm not an expert in climate change, but I can tell you right now that government is not going to be able to solve this problem. You can't regulate your way out of this. You can't electric vehicle your way out of this. You're going to have to innovate your way out of this, especially back in the year 2000 when they're saying, in 7 years, the planet's gone. We're dead. By 2007, we're dead. And it's like, well, then if you're expecting Sacramento to fix that or Washington, D.C. to fix that, there ain't even going to be subcommittee hearings in 7 years on that. So, like, that's not the way this is going to work. Private industry, and I had a really phenomenal talk with the chief executive officer of Los Angeles County. We were at a CSAC event. And what they're doing in Los Angeles County is trying to really reconfigure one of the largest governments in the country to focus more on outcomes and the provision of public data to allow for private industry to become more innovative in finding those solutions. That is increasingly going to be the way the institution of government is focused. Less on outcomes it's not constituted to deliver in this age, and more on the provision of quality data that can be believed in and have the confidence in so that other solutions can be found. Because I will tell you what, everybody here can get on their phone right now and order my book and have it delivered here within a couple of hours. How many government services can you have that same thing done with and for? Okay, good luck. Like your generation, if I put a bunch of people of your generation and entrepreneurs and tech people into a room and said, we want you to solve all of these problems that government is involved in, not a single one of you would come up with the way it's currently done. Nobody would do it that way. And that's not a criticism of government. In many ways, it's an homage by saying that has existed since the library at Alexandria. That's what we created these institutions to work, but this age, government doesn't work that way anymore. So the purpose of government, if it's to provide services, is probably going to need to get out of the service delivery business at some point in the near future and more towards the articulation of what the problem is and allowing for innovations to solve in a better delivered way what those problems are. And I think that's not just a government thing. I think that will ultimately be a media thing.
I hate to kind of blow everybody's mind here and tell you I'm totally crazy, but I will say there is one emergent institution that I see globally that we're not paying enough attention to, that the federal government absolutely is, that you're going to see tremendous, tremendous strides taken when the new administration is set in, and it's Bitcoin. And I'm going to tell you why. Bitcoin, and I didn't say cryptocurrency. You'll know the difference because you're of the age to know the difference between Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Bitcoin is run by an algorithm. It's mathematics, and it's constructed in a way where it cannot be influenced by human beings. That's what gives us the confidence, is because across language, across culture, math is math. And it's not like the Fed that comes in and raises interest rates or lowers interest rates. It can't be messed with. That's the confidence you can find, so that when I was in Ukraine, there was no gas in the streets. There was no electricity. We couldn't take out cash. I didn't realize this. I'd never been in a country under martial law before, but you can't go to the ATM machine and go get out, cash or currency. But everybody who had a phone could exchange Bitcoin. And that was the way trading was done, was on Bitcoin on your phone. And I say that because it is going to be, I think, within the lifetimes of everybody, most people in this room, the common currency of the world. The Fed is already talking about, making a huge position as part of our own reserve in Bitcoin, because it is becoming the global currency, global standard, because it's predicated on math as an institution. So sorry to veer too far off, but that's a solution that we're finding for monetary policy.
The first part of your commentary was so on brand for being a Republican, man. I couldn't even, just like the down with the government situation. I got to say that there are things, I just want to push back a little bit on it as the government person here, which is that, I don't see Amazon can deliver your book, but they're not going to deliver the military. They're not going to deliver things that don't make a profit. There's a value to, and I think that what the risk is, and I don't want to, because I want to get back to the questions, but the risk is that if we continue to find, there's got to be a way to criticize the institution without undermining the institution. I think that and I'm not saying you're undermining the institution, but I think that there's a value still to recognizing what government can deliver that private industry can.
And always will.
Way to ensure that private industry has a role within government, but I don't think that I just don't put my faith in all the corporations to solve all my life problems either, man.
No, but I didn't say that. But I didn't say that either.
And if that was the impression, I don't believe that at all. I'm not making that statement at all. What I am saying is this. It was a great book, and I do believe it's a great book, that was written by a California politician. The book was called Citizenville. It was written by the governor, Gavin Newsom. The basic argument for what he was writing as lieutenant governor was that government is becoming a platform. And what he meant by that is, if it's a service delivery system in the digital age, then being an access point is probably the primary purpose of what government should exist for. It doesn't mean that we should privatize prisons or privatize the military, but it does mean that we can and should be always, always looking by the warehousing of data to find better solutions as government, always. And because if we don't, things like Uber happen. Right? The government's trying to regulate the taxi cab industry, and it's trying to figure out a better way to regulate the taxi cab industry. Meanwhile, somebody creates an app that just kind of dances around it 150,000 times without them even realizing, maybe our, policies are irrelevant. Again, as part of this study of this movement from the agriculture to the agricultural age to the Industrial Revolution, we're looking at policies that cities were putting in place to regulate. They used to have what were called red flag laws. Every time a car would come into a town, a young boy usually would run ahead of the car waving a red flag. This was city policy to move the horses away because automobiles were scaring the horses. And so that became the city policy. The inability of government to imagine that we weren't going to be using horses very soon, it would never occurred to them. So we had years of government creating policies, and I'm not saying they were bad, I'm just saying we have to have people that understand that the services that government is currently involved in, I don't think they'll necessarily be done by corporations. I think they'll be done in an entirely unique and different way. But to think that the way we're doing government right now is going to exist in 10 years is crazy.
More questions? Yes.
At one point you said that there were the seeds of better values and institutions, but you didn't really elucidate on what they were. So I'd like to hear more about your reasons for optimism.
Well, let me first, and again, I don't want to get into a right-left debate because I honestly don't believe there's a right-left spectrum anymore. But what I will say is this: I don't think that there's any state that has failed people of color in this union any more than California has over the past 30 years. As somebody who has been working in the Latino community, fighting and advocating for Latinos in this community, the disproportionate amount of the housing crisis, the obesity crisis, which is a sign of poverty, by the way, because people are malnourished, the very, very low quality of the education, the extraordinary number of remedial education required in community college system of our high school graduates that can't even read. I could go on, and I have. That's not a function of the market. That is a function of government getting in the way. And I'm not arguing against government. I've worked for government. I've worked for cities. I've worked for counties my entire career. I'm a very big believer in government. But I'm also a bigger believer in solutions. And the evidence is overwhelming that this fight between markets and government regulation is an irrelevant fight in this era and in this age. It's why we're not having that discussion anymore at the federal level. As I mentioned, Donald Trump isn't extolling the virtues of smaller government any more than, Bill Clinton was saying the end of, big government, the era of big government is over. Like neither of them are valid arguments. What people are saying and they're rejecting is that the system, however it's defined, isn't working, and institutions are inevitably and invariably, they believe, the cause of that, with one grand notable exception: Latinos. Latinos do believe in institutions, despite having less evidence than everybody else in this room to believe that way. Now, again, a lot of that may be a function of youth. They're not smart enough to know that tomorrow isn't gonna be better for them than it should be. It's like my son, right? He doesn't realize it. He's played by the rules, he's done all the right things, got the right education. He's like, okay, I'm ready to go take over the world. And I'm like, you can't afford to live. You can't afford to live in the Bay Area. Maybe you're making $250,000 a year. That's gonna get you, maybe, if you're lucky, a studio apartment in Palo Alto, if you can find one. Good luck with that, right? So that whole contract is broken. That's my argument. Is I'm not arguing for or against. What I'm saying is the belief in the system, the belief in America is what we need right now as we reimagine our institutions. Because if we have neither institutions that work, nor a faith and confidence that we will find it, you end up with what we have in a wide swath of America today, which is, if I don't like the outcome, storm the Capitol and overthrow the election because I want my tribal chieftain in charge, not their tribal chieftain in charge. And that's all our politics has essentially become.
Another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, just thanks for tonight. We'd love to hear you riff a little bit more or elaborate more on your, you have a sense that there's really a pan-Latino identity that's emerging across all the diversity and demographics and national origins and all the rest. And I just got to share two of my favorite data points from recent chats. One was that with regard to apprehensions of crossings of the U.S.-Mexico border between ports of entry, in 2007, 9 out of 10 were Mexican ancestry. In 2024, 1 in 4 were Mexican ancestry.
Say that again so people hear you.
In 2007, 9 out of 10 people apprehended crossing between ports of entry were Mexican ancestry.
Yeah.
In 2024, 1 in 4, 25%, were Mexican ancestry. So the cross-border migration is just blown. It's a global phenomenon driven by cell phone technology and global migration patterns, all the rest, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So. Yeah. And then my other data point, which is kind of a set up against that, is that 7 in 10 voters, this Hispanic or Latino voters, whatever you want, were either Mexican ancestry or Puerto Rican.
Yeah.
So you basically have an overwhelmingly Mexican and Puerto Rican electorate facing a demographic migration trends, which look nothing like what they experienced in their family histories and in their growing up. And so they're voting, against border enforcement strategies and other policies that they perceive to be favoring, right?
Exactly right.
This generation of migrants, because they don't identify with this generation of migrants who are behaving in ways that are, not consistent with their own.
I'm glad I wrote the book before you did. Yeah, look, that's exactly right. And let me take it one step further, because those are very powerful data points. Let me talk about voters for just a second. Los Angeles County, a couple counties to the north, the largest Latino county in all of America. In 2002, 54% of all new Latino voters were foreign born. This is in 2002, 54%. By 2022, exactly 20 years later, that number was 8%. In fact, I gave this same talk in those gateway cities of South Central Los Angeles. A city council member came up to me and said, "You finally putting data to what we're experiencing. In our city government, we were apportioning a huge part of our budget to educating people on naturalizing 10, 12 years ago. Today, we can't find people to come in and become naturalized citizens here anymore. And they're screaming about housing, right? There's a new need for government priorities, as it should be. But that dramatic a change in that short a period of time has created this chasm. And so the question, and you're asking a really good question, is what does that mean for Latinidad, which is a word for Latino identity? What is our common cultural characteristic? And as I explore in the book, 60% of all Latinos in this country are of Mexican-American descent. And it's not that it's that big, although that is big, it's that every other group is so small. The next largest group are Puerto Ricans that are 9%. There's no other group that's even double digits. And Puerto Ricans are Americans. I know we all know this. Some of you might have forgotten. I'm going to say it again. They're Americans by birth. They're not going through a naturalizations process. So, and then Cubans, by the way, are fourth at 5%. You would think Cubans are like 80% of Latinos out there because of the narrative of of our politics. But Cubans are a very small percent of the Latino community, and this cross-pan-Latino, Latinidad identity, I call it the Latinization of America. The truth is, folks, it's the Mexicanization of America. That's where all the birth rates are exploding. But they're second, third, and fourth generation, which prioritize this American identity in a very optimistic, confident in our institutions way. Now, so what does that mean for the common glue? Or is there even such a thing as Latino? Which is a very fair question. It's one we're going to be asking ourselves a lot over the next decade as Americans. But what I have found is the common thread, the common cultural thread across all Latino demographics is it's the blue-collar workforce. It's economic. And that is absolutely a glue. It used to stitch the Irish and the Italians and the Poles and the Greeks and the Jews together 100 years ago. There's no reason it cannot do the same. It is doing the same, and they're voting along class lines in a way that they prioritize over that receding ethnic identity. And so when we recognize and come to understand that the United States of America has always had a blue-collar culture centered on the idea that tomorrow will be better for my kids if I struggle and work and make the sacrifices now, not for myself, but for the next generation, that is blue-collar culture. We can talk about, yes, they've got higher church attendance rates. Yes, they've got higher rental rates as opposed to home ownership. All of those are true. The cultural value is I'm committed to this country, not for what it's going to do for me, but for my kids. That's the American idea. That's the optimism that this crazy American experiment requires. And it is what we have lost with those, by the way, those that are 60 years of age and older, which includes nobody in this room, fortunately, right, has the lowest levels of confidence and support in the idea of America of any generation ever polled. I mentioned this earlier, despite being the wealthiest, most privileged generation this country has ever produced. Completely lost confidence despite being the apex of what America's promise was. That's heartbreaking, and it's shameful. But that culture is transforming, and again, that's the heart of the book, based off of this commonality of an ethnic group which is emerging as an economic voting bloc, and it centers us back on that promise of America and gets us away from fighting over which trans athletes can compete in which and use which bathroom and whatever the hell we're fighting about anymore.
Final question.
How do you think this rounding up the people are here now might affect the solidarity or the glue in the Latino culture? And how do you think it's going to play out? Is it going to really get messy with camps and deportations and policing and sanctuary movements? How do you think so?
Great question. And remember, this lull that we're feeling right now, we have a very long interregnum. From November 6th to January 20 is a long time for a country to process, especially something this big. So there's a lot of feeling of helplessness right now. That's going to change on January 21st. Opposition will mobilize. No one will remember if Bernie Sanders was right or Amy Klobuchar was right or what Latinos did. All of that stuff is going to fade very quickly by the end of January into a big national, at least half the country's opposition to what is likely to come, which includes this promise of mass deportations. Now, we have gone through 2 mass deportations. And by mass, I mean 1 million people or more, okay? The first time was in the 1930s, which we historically now call the Mexican repatriation, which is a nice way of sane-washing what we were doing, which is rounding up people, pulling them off factory lines and out of fields to repatriate as if it was a voluntary self-deportation. It was anything but. By the way, we estimate that out of the 1.7, 1.8 people that were repatriated, about 800,000 of them were U.S. citizens, okay? So about a little over half of the 1.8 million people repatriated to Mexico were not Mexicans. They were U.S. citizens. And incidentally, part of that was making way for jobs from the Dust Bowlers and the Okies that we have romanticized coming out in Steinbeck novels to work in the fields. The only reason they had jobs in those fields is because our government and the Mexican government deported Mexicans to Mexico and U.S. citizens to provide those sustenance jobs to white people. That, and we didn't want to provide New Deal monies to brown people either. Those were for white people, okay? The second time we did it was with what was called Operation Wetback. Literally, that was the name of it. During the Eisenhower administration, where we brought in the military to do the exact same thing, slightly smaller in scope, but over half, again, of people repatriated were U.S. citizens, including, and I didn't know this, my dear friend who passed away, a gentleman by the name of Cruz Reynoso, the first Latino Supreme Court Justice of California, was deported as an infant when his family, farm workers, were removed from the country. He and his U.S.-born brothers and sisters were sent to Mexico, deep into Mexico, because they didn't want people coming north. The reason why we did that then was because of a labor shortage in Mexico. So the Mexican government wanted their citizens back, their chattel labor back. And U.S. farmers were actually, the Bracero program, which I think many of you have heard of, was right in the middle of Operation Wetback during that repatriation. And what happened there was U.S. farmers, California farmers specifically, some Texas farmers, didn't want to go to and fill out the paperwork for braceros, so they went out and were recruiting south of the border to sneak people across the border to work while the U.S. and Mexican government were deporting others, including U.S. citizens, to Mexico. We've never done it successfully, a mass deportation. Now, sorry about that long windup, but that's a history that we don't even know even in California because it's not taught in our public schools. Far bigger than the Japanese internment, far worse than the Chinese exclusion laws. We're talking well over 1 million people in both instances. Having said that, if Donald Trump does have camps and focuses, we've talked about this, on violent offenders first and foremost, I think he will find widespread public support for that. If, however, he starts cracking down on economies that we need, like agriculture, hotel industry, most service sectors. By the way, California, again, one of the worst offenders here. One of the absolute worst offenders. California is the most segregated, by the way, segregated state in the union, far more than Mississippi, all by zip code. It can tell you what your income and your race is basically with a high degree of certainty based off of the zip code that you live in. The jobs we're creating for the undocumented are these service sector jobs that we take great pride in as a government, saying, look at all the jobs we're creating. These are service sector jobs. We're creating a servant class for wealthier, white, older people, okay? That's why you get Starbucks and you get your gardening services and you get, all these services that you want for a very, very low price. That is going to have to change. If that is threatened, if my Starbucks is threatened, remember after COVID, the restaurant industry was shut down and they were saying, oh, people aren't going back to work because they got a $400 check 4 months ago and they're sitting around playing video games. That's not what happened. What happened was the immigrants left during COVID. You reopened the restaurant, there's nobody to work the back of the restaurant, so they couldn't find labor. They certainly couldn't find cheap labor. So that starts an inflationary cycle because you got to pay more money to have people who don't otherwise do those jobs to come into that work. You start seeing effects in that industry, you're going to see huge blowback from employers. There are 3 constituencies that can prevent that from happening. The business community, which absolutely will fight the Trump administration on it. The faith-based community, which will be led by the Catholic Church, probably not as much the Protestant evangelicals, who are more than happy to kick the refugee out of here. And the third, I would argue, is the national security community that's going to be very worried about population decline, because the truth of the matter is our government cannot work without cheap labor paying into the tax system to pay for Medicaid and Social Security. It will become insolvent within a matter of months if you have mass deportations. And politically, that won't fly.
Well, Mike, I appreciate, and I think everybody here appreciates this very serious and important conversation.
Thank you all. Thank you.